All right. Well, I think we'll get today started. So thank you everyone for taking time out of your day today to spend it with us. We have an exciting lineup to discuss thoughts on the upcoming U.S. election and what impact that might have on your investments, your tax situation, estate plan, and longer term financial plan. So just a bit of housekeeping before we get started here. You can type in questions through the Q&A option that's at the bottom of the little Zoom ribbon there, and we'll look to answer as many of those as possible on the call today. And we also plan to have a recording available in the coming days. So if you'd like to review it any further or forward on to anyone else who might be interested, we'll have that available as soon as possible. So with that, we'll get started. My name is Matt Carvalho, Chief Investment Officer here at Cardinal Point. I'll be your host for the webinar today, and I'm excited to introduce our lineup here, which truly does include the two perfect guests. First, in the middle of the screen here, my colleague, Terry Ritchie. Many of you may be familiar with him already. Vice President here at Cardinal Point and really the authority on tax and estate planning across the U.S. and Canada. Now, Terry is joining us fresh off several professional conferences, including Trust and Estate Practitioners, where he's been educating other financial advisors on potential tax and estate planning considerations leading up to the election. And then to the right of the screen here, a longtime friend of mine, Apollo Lupescu, PhD and Vice President at Dimensional Fund Advisors. Now, DFA is a 40-year-old investment firm managing over $750 billion in client assets around the globe. Apollo has been with Dimensional for over 20 years now. Prior to that, he was a professor of finance at University of California, Santa Barbara, and also a water polo coach. So welcome to you both.
Hi, Matt. Great to see you.
Yeah, thanks, Matt.
Great to have you both with us. So I'll turn it over in just a moment, but shortly just wanted to provide a few seconds background on Cardinal Point for anyone who may be meeting us for the first time. So excuse me, Cardinal Point is really a comprehensive wealth management firm founded in 2010, offering expertise in financial planning, investments, taxes, estate planning, insurance, immigration, and healthcare. Now, there's about 45 professionals, those of us working at the firm across a variety of locations in the US and Canada. And really today we're working with over 1,000 households. We're managing over $2 billion of assets on clients' behalf for executives, entrepreneurs, professional athletes, including about 150 active NHL players, and retirees of all sorts. So lastly, just before going on into some of the meat of the presentation, I just want to kind of set the stage from an investment perspective. So despite escalating geopolitical concerns, ongoing concerns around a potential recession or election anxiety, virtually all investments have seen truly excellent returns here in 2024. The combination of strong and resilient economic growth, along with falling inflation and global central banks going into an easing phase, has really created what I would call a Goldilocks scenario for investors. Now, if we take a look at some of those returns over the last year, U.S. markets have again led the way with truly remarkable returns above 35%, compounding on some excellent returns that we saw the previous 12 months. Now, there's been much talk about volatility or valuations, election risk, trying to time markets or pick when things might top. But meanwhile, the S&P 500 just keeps advancing, hitting 46 new highs thus far in 2024. Meanwhile, Canadian stocks have also experienced a well above average year with tremendous returns nearing 29%. And we're actually one of the best indexes around the globe in the third quarter of this year. International stocks, you can see there in the blue line, have also done quite well over the last year, up over 22%, again, well above those historical averages. And then lastly here, after a few challenging years in the fixed income market, we actually see bonds rebounding quite nicely with this gain of over 10% in total return over the last 12 months. So with that, where we sit today, we're about 3 weeks out from Election Day. And if we take a quick look at most polling sites, we can see that we're still virtually at a dead heat for the presidency. The Senate appears that it may be heading towards Republican control, while the House is also essentially a coin flip. So a lot of uncertainty out there about what the political landscape might look like going into 2025. But let's go into some details about what investors might want to be thinking through. And for that, I wanted to bring in Apollo, who's literally been speaking with thousands of investors on this exact topic in recent months. So with that, Apollo, I'll let you share your screen here, and we can hop into some of the topics we wanted to cover today.
Well, first of all, Matt and Terry, thank you so much for the invitation to be part of this webinar, and thanks to everyone for taking the time to attend. And to kind of maximize the viewing experience, to get the most out of it, if you folks want to roll your mouse on the upper right-hand side of the Zoom window, there's a view button. And if you click on the view button, could you please make sure that it's on speaker view, but also click on full screen, such that the video covers the entire screen. Because I'll be sharing whatever information that I'll be sharing. It will be through the video feed rather than the traditional share. So it would be best if you have that full screen. And with that out of the way, let's get going. And you're right, Matt. Over the past few months, I have traveled the country and the world to some degree, talking to investors about the election and kind of gauging a little bit their feelings. And one thing that became so apparent is that there is anxiety about this election among investors everywhere across the political spectrum. And in some parts of the country, folks are concerned that what if we have the government coming in and maybe tell us what to do more than we want? In other parts of the country, people are concerned that what if we have somebody in the White House who doesn't have the character or the just the personality, and it will be chaos over the next 4 years, and perhaps even our democratic institutions might start to erode. So all this is creating anxiety. And on top of that, Matt and Terry, you have these deeply emotional issues that don't have to do with business, but they touch on our core identity as individuals, our deeply held beliefs, such as reproductive rights. You have civil rights. So when you package it all together, what I find is that there are some very, very strong emotions among investors as it relates to this election. And I actually think it's perfectly fine to have those emotions because that's what makes us human, and act upon them the right way. I mean, us in the U.S. and Canada, maybe I'll set aside for a second. But in the U.S., you have the opportunity in a couple of weeks to go vote. So go vote, get involved in a campaign, do something to align your emotions with what you'd like to see as the outcome of the election. No, that's perfectly fine. What I also found over the 20 plus years in this career is that really successful investors in general can acknowledge these emotions, honor them, and at the same time disentangle them from investment decisions. And whatever decisions they make about their money, they're made on much more pragmatic reasons driven by data and evidence rather than how they feel. And that's what I want to do for the rest of this session, is really not tell you, what you should feel or it's good or bad about any one party, but let you ultimately decide for yourself by showing you some numbers. And that's kind of what I want to do. And to set the stage, I want to do two things here. The first one is to talk about what Matt, to emphasize what Matt said. When you're thinking about your money and how your money is invested, it is not based on just some random factors, but rather very specifically to your circumstances, your needs, your risk capacity, and all of these are incorporated into a plan that looks at taxes, estate planning, but also when do you need the money, how much money you need. And in that particular plan, what's so fascinating is that today, most folks are not solely invested in the stock market. And I know we're going to talk a lot about the stock market today, but it's quite possible that particularly as you get closer to retirement, or you just, you want to be able to sleep at night, a part of your money is not invested in stocks, but rather in bonds, which is a form of lending and that has very different dynamics than the stock market. So I want to kind of to begin with to tell you that it is quite likely that not all your money is invested in the stock market. And to take it a step further, only a portion of the stock market investings that you have might actually be in US or Canadian companies. Because there's a global opportunity set, and there are 10,000 plus companies across the world. And this is what Matt and Terry, and particularly Matt as the chief investment officer, they look at what opportunities might be abroad, and the dynamics of those markets might be different. So to begin with, we're going to talk a lot about stocks, particularly in the US, but just to let you know, that your financial investments might be well beyond just the U.S. stock market. It could be bonds, international stocks, and so forth. So, and that's something that's very personalized to each one of you. That's why I can't say there's an optimal solution. Every one of you might have a different mix. So Matt, and if you have any thoughts on that, otherwise I can just keep going on this.
Yeah, no, I'd say let's hear some of your other thoughts on it. And I know, yourself and all the folks at DFA have done a ton of research on this over the years, so it'd be helpful to hear some of those insights.
Okay, so let's talk about your money and the election. So to begin with, when we think about the stock market, those words stock market sometimes resemble a bit of a gambling casino. You lose money, you make money. I actually would argue that a better way to describe the stock market is an ownership mark, where you and I, everybody on this call, is allowed to go buy ownership in companies that we did not start. I have nothing to do with Microsoft or Bill Gates, and yet I'm allowed to own a piece of Microsoft, which entitles me to part of the earnings and the profits that that company will make. Not as much as Bill Gates, but certainly conceptually, I have the same rights. And the reason I think it's so important is because when you're investing in the stock market, you are basically buying ownership into that company. And the function of this mart is to somehow figure out how much is that worth it? How much should you pay to own a piece of that business? And that is fundamentally the function of the market. So in that context, what the market's really trying to answer is what is the impact of an election and different proposal, different policies on the earnings and the profits of different companies. And that's really what the market's trying to answer. Let's look at each company and let's find out what's the impact going to be if we have one candidate or the other. And given that we don't know exactly, as Matt said, it's a toss-up right now, there's an expectation. So the market doesn't always price uncertainties. Quite often it prices expectation. What do we expect to happen and what the outcome might be of that particular policy. So let's take some examples to kind of really illustrate this, in a more clear way. The previous administration, the Trump administration, they made a point to encourage domestic manufacturing. So, let's just make more things in the U.S. Great. And one of the industries that they honed in on was the steel industry. And they said, well, we want to promote domestic steel. And what's interesting is that when they start talking about this, there is a company that carries the name of the industry that is called United States Steel Corporation. And it was quite interesting to see what are the lessons that we can learn from a government policy impacting a particular stock or a sector for that matter. So there are two things that we learned, and I will illustrate in a second. The first thing that we learned is that the stock market investors, they are forward-looking. In other words, they're sitting here today looking and forming an expectation about the future before the future even comes. So if it's a sunny day, it's a great, beautiful day, but you see clouds on the horizon. You pull up your app and it says rain is coming. You're going to grab an umbrella before the rain comes. That's what the market does. It's forward-looking and it prices in expectations of positive outcomes from a policy before the policy gets even implemented. And what's fascinating today, the market is so competitive that process is incredibly quick. Pricing in expected information, expected outcomes, it's incredibly quick. And what it means to you in practical terms is that by the time you read that, it's quite possible that the price already adjusted up to reflect the positive impact of that policy. And by the time you buy it, it might be too late because it's already been priced in. And if you buy it at this high price, it might not be a good deal. So that's the first thing that we learned. Markets are incredibly competitive today, and they're very quick to price in anything that might benefit or not benefit a company. And secondly, is that the impact of these policies, it tends to be very specific to a company rather than the sector as a whole. And the same set of policies might have a very different impact on different companies, even within the same sector, because there are other factors that might matter. Their products, their strategy, how they executed, whatever else might be going on, competitors and so forth. So it's not easy to kind of paint with a broad brush across all the companies in a sector. So let's look now at the example that I mentioned earlier, United States Steel Corporation. And as the administration came in, what was interesting is that that particular stock price dropped by more than half in a fairly short time. And that's when you saw basically the administration talking about perhaps putting tariffs against foreign producers to help United States Steel. Now, there was no clarity, there was no certainty. There was just an expectation that perhaps the government will do something to help U.S. Steel. And perhaps that was the reason why you saw this huge rise in the price of U.S. Steel. And an expectation of something that might or might not come, and there was no clarity on that. And it turns out that in March of 2018, we did have these steel tariffs announced that gave United States Steel Corporation a huge competitive advantage in the U.S. market. So if you're an investor saying, aha, now we have the government fully backing this particular industry and this company, this is great. Let's go buy some of this stock. What would have been the outcome for you as an investor? Well, it turns out that from that point to the remainder to the time when the administration left the White House, that particular stock pretty much tanked and lost the majority of its value. So despite having this this incredible backing of the U.S. government and tariffs to very clearly give you a competitive advantage, it meant nothing to the stock of U.S. Steel. How come? Well, intuitively, it's possible that when we make it harder for foreigners to compete, they might reciprocate. They might just say, well, you're going to make it harder on me? Don't feel bad that I'm going to do the same thing to you. So perhaps U.S. Steel had a harder time selling because tariffs are a double-edged sword. It's possible that their products or their customer service or whatever the case might be didn't work out very well, and that might be the reason why it dropped, not because of that policy coming from the government. So it is interesting that both of the principles that I mentioned, they are reflected in this case study. And for the current administration, you have a different priority. And we heard a lot about green energy. And you look at the hurricanes and the storms that hit Florida and North Carolina, and certainly people are kind of being made a little more aware that, boy, the things are changing and maybe we need to do something. And in that respect, the current administration has been promoting solar panels, solar power as a way to move away from fossil fuel. And Matt and Terry, I remember 3 years ago, I looked at putting solar panels on my roof, not because of the administration, I just wanted to save some money on electricity. And I got a bid from a company called First Solar. And recently I wanted to go and see, well, how did First Solar do now that the government is putting tariffs against foreign producers and is fully backing this idea of green energy? And what you saw is that over the past 3.5 years, since we've had this policy, First Solar more than doubled in price. You would have more than doubled your money, 2 times your money in the past 3.5 years, which is a really phenomenal result. So perhaps there is something about kind of having the government backing you up in a policy specifically targeting that industry. But also remember that at the time, I didn't want to be foolish and just go with one bid. I got another bid, and at Costco, there was a booth with a different company called Sunrun. So I also looked at Sunrun. How did Sunrun do over the same exact time period? And interestingly, even though they started neck and neck in terms of stock price, over the same exact time period, Sunrun lost 75% of its value, 75% of its value, despite having exactly the same policy as First Solar. So it's quite possible that the same policy might not benefit everybody. And at the beginning of this administration, it wasn't clear at all which one of these are going to succeed or not. The price was pretty much the same. And not too long ago, I was in Oklahoma, and somebody did ask me, well, but probably a lot better than if you put money in fossil fuel, because not a lot of friends they have in DC these days. And I was curious to see, well, what if you actually stuck with fossil fuel or kept that in your portfolio, not kind of get discouraged by the fact that it's not being promoted. So when I looked at the price per share of ExxonMobil over the exact same time frame, it more than tripled. It more than tripled. Despite the fact that solar power is certainly not fossil fuel is certainly not a priority for the current administration. So which kind of goes to show you folks that it's a very seductive narrative. Let's pay attention to what the government might do and pile money into this sector or the other sector. It's just not in the data. It's not in the data to suggest that you're going to benefit from that in one way or another. So you should avoid certain industry or put money into others. It's not clear at all. And it doesn't appear that that should form the basis of an investment decision. Now, these are sector related. So what I wanted to know is like, okay, what if you expand? And instead of sectors, you are looking more broadly at the entire U.S. economy. And the presidents, and this is kind of what we're voting for right now, the presidents certainly have a big say in there. And in that respect, I thought, okay, let's look at presidents, their party, their policies, and see how the markets get impacted and what can we learn from that data. And we have data going back to 1926, but in this particular case, I didn't want to go all the way there, but rather looked in my lifetime. I was born in 1969, and I'm 55 years old or so. And over the past 55 years, the S&P 500, which is the measure of the U.S. stock market, has been growing at a rate of about 10% per year. And I want to use that yardstick because I want to compare how different presidents did with different policies relative to this yardstick of 10%. And because different presidents had different length in the White House, it's probably best to compare the average annualized for them as well as the market. So we're going to look at the average annualized for different presidents while they were in the White House. How did the market do compared to this 10% yardstick? And there are 9 presidents with completed terms in my lifetime. And when I was born, and by the way, before I even do this, I just want you to just think of the president who might have the highest returns while they were in the White House, during which president did the market do best, and then also during which president might the market have done worst. Because I want to compare your ideas and your perceptions with the reality of the data. So when I was born, President Richard Nixon was in the White House. And for the 5.5 years that he was president, the market did not grow. Forget about a 10% average. It dropped by 2.9% per year for about 5.5 years while he was in the White House. And then he resigned, and his vice president, Jerry Ford, came along, and the market skyrocketed at 20+% per year. And then in 1977, he loses to Jimmy Carter, and he gets in there for one term, and the market does a little bit above average, 11.7%. And then in the 1980s, we have President Reagan for 2 terms, 8 years. The market does really well once again, 15.8% annualized. And then his vice president, George H.W. Bush, comes in, and the market goes up by about 13.9% per year annualized. He's there for 4 years, 1 term, and then he loses to President Clinton in the 90s. And we had an average of about 17.6 during the Clinton years. And then there's Bush versus Gore election. President George W. Bush wins. And he's there for 2 terms. And for the 8 years of the George W. Bush administration, the market drops on average by 4.4% per year for 8 years. And then we had President Obama and then President Trump. So, I want to leave this here for a second, and I want you to look at the data, because the first question is a pretty fundamental one. Is it obvious that having a Republican or a Democrat in the White House is better or worse for the markets? And I've asked this question to folks across the country, across the world, and nobody could tell me, yeah, it's obvious. It doesn't appear obvious at all, despite the fact that we want to believe that one is better than the other. It's just not in the data. But the second thing is look at policies and how these policies might impact the market. And what if I told you that there's a president who comes in and it's very clear, we want the stock market to do well. And in fact, we're going to cut rates specifically to stock market investing, capital gains and dividends. So it's very specific policies towards supporting the stock market. Well, as an investor, what would you think? Well, that's great. I mean, this is going to be a boon for the market and I should jump all in. Well, who was that president? It was none other than President George W. Bush. George W. Bush. And despite that incredibly, those very incredibly positive and supportive policies for the market, it tanked by 4.4% for 8 years on average. Well, how come? What happened? Well, he walked in just as the dot-com was going bust. How much did he have to do with that? Nothing at all. 9/11 happened 9 months into his term, and he walked off at the bottom of the financial crisis. Should we say that he was a terrible president for the markets because look how poor the returns are? I don't think it's fair. The same way that you look at President Clinton and you say, well, he had phenomenal returns, but he walked in just as Microsoft and Pets.com and Amazon, all these companies are flying high. And I don't think the White House had much to do with that. They're just that's on them. And so in that respect, perhaps it's not fair to give a president credit for how the market does, despite what we might want to believe. So ultimately, it's interesting because there's a narrative that everybody has in their mind. But when you look at the data and the facts, it doesn't always line up. But I've also heard a lot about President Reagan because he was incredibly business friendly, tax cuts, policies towards growth, and the market responded really well. And people are pointing out it went up by 15.8% annualized for 8 years, which is fantastic. So perhaps the markets do respond to that particular type of policy. And I also remember that when President Obama was running, in some parts of the country, there was a grave concern that this president is not really focused on tax cuts or business-friendly policies, and it's going to be a bloodbath in the market. It is going to be terrible. I need to sell everything and move to Canada. Actually, that's a saying that I hear quite often. And people were scared to be invested because they thought it's going to be a bloodbath and it's going to be terrible for the stock market having somebody focused on social programs. And indeed, President Obama's signature accomplishment is around healthcare and Obamacare. Well, how poorly did the markets do? During the 8 years, the same as President Reagan of the Obama administration, on average, the markets went up by 16%. How different is it having a president that is hyper-focused on business versus one that is super focused on healthcare and for the country? Not different at all. So once again, it doesn't appear that presidential policies or towards the market or generally towards the economy have a direct impact to how the market does. We can have a variety of priorities, and yet the markets still do what they do. So it is quite interesting to look at the data because a lot of people want to believe that one party or another, one set of policies, it's just not in the data at all. But it's not all about presidents, and I do have to say that in all this we focus so much on the election of the president, and yet we do have Congress at play as well. A lot of these initiatives they do have to get passed by Congress, and what gets complicated here is that you can say, well, one party control this, but not that, and then it gets complicated. You start splitting hairs, and I don't have any. So 3 years ago, something happened that kind of triggered an idea. 3 years ago, there was a special runoff in Georgia in January, and the two Democrats won their Senate races. And at that point, the Democrats controlled the White House, the Senate, and the House at the same time. So that kind of triggered the natural experiment in my mind. Well, what if you look at times in the history of the markets, going back to the 20s, and you explore years when one party was in full control? So they controlled the White House, they controlled the Senate, and they controlled the House at the same time. So there's no place to hide. They had everything because that would be clear, like which party might be better or worse for the market and investors. And with that in mind, 3 years ago, I actually started running the data. And what I found is that the Republicans, in fact, had this single party unified government control for 13 years. And it was across different years. And if you take a simple average, just a simple average of the 13 years, you see that the market went up by 14.52%, which is a nice outcome. And the question is, did the Democrats also have it? Yes, but it wasn't for 13 years. It was for a lot longer. It was 34 years. And the question is, how do the markets do then? And I remember 3 years ago when I showed these numbers, somebody from the audience stood up and said, listen, you're going to try to sell me on the idea that this party's better than the other. He was very upset, and you cooked up the numbers. And I'm like, no, I'm just going to share the numbers. You make whatever you want out of them. But by the way, we did have the PhDs in the research group double check to make sure that this is correct, because I know it's a very sensitive number. So when we looked at the 34 years of the Democrats being in control, during those 34 years, the market on average went up by 14.52%. It is identical
Wow.
to the second decimal. To the second decimal. That's crazy. So when people are saying that one party is better than another, one president, one set of policies, there's nothing in the data, nothing at all in the data to support that idea. It's just emotions. It is ultimately all emotions because you look at the data, remember this number 14.52, identical to the second decimal. And yet that's not what most people want to believe. They really want to believe that it's going to be a disaster if their candidate loses the election. And that's exactly what's going to happen with half the country. They'll be bitterly disappointed and they'll see it very darkly. And the other half will be ecstatic and very positive about it. I think we should acknowledge this is coming. But when you look at the data, there's nothing that ought to tell you as an investor that you should be afraid of one party or another, one set of policies or another. And ultimately, does this mean that politics and elections don't matter? That's not at all what I'm saying. It's all about this idea of ownership in companies, and the value of the ownership depends on so many variables. So there are many variables that impact the profits of a Microsoft or Apple or Nvidia or Coca-Cola, McDonald's. There's so many variables, and politics and elections is certainly one of them. For some companies more than others. It just doesn't appear to be a primary variable, one that he can link the outcome of an election to the results of any one company or the market as a whole. That's where the disconnect is there's no direct link there. And Matt and Terry, the way that I thought about this is baking cookies with my daughter. And when you put in the eggs, the sugar, the flour, the butter, you mix it all in, you pop the cookie in the oven. When the cookie's done and you break it apart, you can't really point and say, aha, I recognize the egg yolk in there. No, you can't. It's mixed in with so many other ingredients, it's indistinguishable. And that's what I think the politics is in the election is that it's the egg yolk in a cookie. It's somewhere in there. You can't really tell exactly where. And because of that, you ought not to build an entire investment strategy around it. Don't make like an egg yolk cookie. Just let it be there the way it is. And the good news is not the garlic in a cookie. It doesn't stink it up enough that you recognize it. But ultimately, that's kind of what we find over and over and over again is that investors tend to be incredibly emotional. They project their emotions onto their stock market beliefs. And when you look at the data, it does not appear to support that particular anxiety.
Great, Apollo. That was really helpful. I had a couple notes there. I really like the cookie analogy, certainly about all the ingredients coming together. And you did steal some thunder. We'll have the quarterly newsletter that I write up that'll go out in just a few days here when all of our statements are ready for each quarter end. I did have a table in there that has a chart that shows some of the previous presidents and which sectors did better or worse. And it is just really shocking that under a Trump administration, it was traditional energy did very poorly, but clean energy did very well. Under Biden, it was just the opposite, when you would think of those two as being, kind of diametrically opposed on what they might want to do regulation-wise with those. And so also to see those stats, the 14.52%, precisely identical, that's pretty amazing, I think, just to really nail home kind of the idea of that it's just so tough to make any predictions or to try to take any actions that would actually benefit you in any way when it comes to this. One other thing I was just going to mention on a personal note, I did put solar panels on our house a number of years ago, and that company actually just went bankrupt earlier this year, the one that had initially installed it and everything.
Oh, no.
Luckily they still work and everything, but it wouldn't have been a good long-term investment there at all.
And Matt, you also have a Tesla too, right?
I do, yeah. So luckily both of them still working, and but neither one has been a good investment recently, I wouldn't say. But one last note too, we do have on our blog, on the Cardinal Point website, under the blog there, we have a recent piece that I had written earlier in the year on politics, just kind of showing some different numbers than Apollo went through today, but definitely the same conclusion, just about how tough it is to try to predict or to make any of those forecasts about what might happen if X, Y, or Z occurs in following the November election here. But probably a good point to transition over to Terry here, and just to kind of give a little bit of, what we wanted to cover here was both the idea of, okay, is there anything we can do on the investment side? And, I think Apollo and I would agree here that there really isn't any, major changes that you should be making to your portfolio or your long-term investment plan, regardless of who wins come November. But on the other side of the coin, excuse me, I think we can, talk about some considerations when it comes to tax or estate planning or some of the other things where maybe, there are some proactive, actions that we want to take, or at least some things to think through about what may happen, in the coming years here.
Well, thanks, Matt. Can you see that on the screen there?
Yes.
Yep. Yeah.
Well, thanks for including me in this presentation. I can virtually see the names of lots of folks that are here that I haven't spoken with for quite some time. And it's great to have such a wonderful turnout. I appreciate the comments from Apollo. I mean, we have been receiving lots of questions from clients related to, how well will the market do if he wins or if she wins. And as you can see, it's crazy though, that graph that you showed, or the numbers that you showed reflective to the Republicans and the Democrats was pretty incredible. And these are incredible times. Now we just need to get somebody that can answer the question that we often get from our clients related to the currency. So if we can get somebody to sort of hammer that one down, I think clients will be pretty pleased. But I think that's a difficult one to resolve. So I wanted to first off say that we're going to be completely agnostic here with respect to the favoritism of maybe one candidate versus another. What I wanted to do today is to share with you some of the insights that we've shared with others at professional conferences I've had the opportunity to speak at for the last little while, related to the proposals that are in place from Trump and from Vice President Harris. So we're going to look at the income, gift, and estate changes, and then I'll comment on some things near the end of my presentation related to the sunsetting of the tax policies that were passed by President Trump when he passed the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act in 2017. So the first thing I wanted to share with you is just the current income tax environment that we find ourselves in. It's interesting to note, as Apollo sort of mentioned, Congress. Who controls Congress is a big part of the kinds of policies, including tax policies, that will ultimately come to pass. And although the Democrats did control the Congress for the first part of the Biden administration, and of course Biden being in president, many of the things that we shared with you almost 4 years ago, Matt and I shared with you almost 4 years ago in terms of what Biden had proposed, did not come to fruition. So here we have, for the last number of years, the environment that Trump had passed on the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. So you can see here on the slide here the current income tax rates that exist, the highest rate being 37%. What's interesting to note here for our Canadian clients, Canadian friends, is that in order to reach the highest marginal rate for U.S. purposes, if you're a married couple filing jointly, you have to have income of greater than $721,000 to get the 37% highest rate that we currently have in the U.S. And then if you're single, that would be $609,000. So anything over and above that would be 37%. Do you want to know what it would take to achieve the highest marginal rates in Ontario, BC, and Alberta? You probably don't, but I'm going to tell you what they are anyways. So in Canada, we have to file separately, even if we have married couples. But for individuals in BC, the highest marginal rate, and this would be BC and federal, and I'll show you some state rates in just a second here as well on the U.S. side. So if your income is over $252,000 in BC, the highest marginal rate is 53.5%. In Alberta, 355, and then your highest marginal rate in Alberta is 48%. And then Ontario, if your income's over $246,000, it's 53.53%. So significant differential in terms of the level of income, or taxable income, that would skew us to the highest marginal rates that we would have in both Canada and the U.S. But currently, these are the marginal rates that would exist for 2024. If we go ahead and throw in the state rates, you can see here, when we add that in there, these are the separate rates. Now, you'll notice up in the top left-hand corner of this map here, we have Washington that has, which many people would say, hey, Terry, this is a state that has no state income tax. And that's sort of partially true. A few years ago, given that Bill Gates lives there and some other folks that have done really well on the technology side, Microsoft and others, they now have a different form of a capital gains tax that would be imposed for certain individuals. So there is a 7% capital gains tax that could be imposed, but not a full state income tax on their overall income. But you can see that when we add in some of these rates, and I'll take a look at that in just a little bit, it can be rather high. And of course, our friend Matt lives in California. And so I always like to grind Matt on that. Although it's a nice place where he lives and he has a wonderful lifestyle, he does pay a fair more amount of tax than folks that live in Arizona or Texas or other parts of the United States. But to each his own, right? This is an interesting slide. This is based on 2023 rates. I shared it with some of the folks I had presented to a number of weeks ago. And of course, no surprise, but this just gives you a sense of what the marginal income tax rates would be related to Canada and the US. And so if you live in Newfoundland and Labrador, it's 54.8%. If you live in the 7 states there, that sort of the 9 states there that have no state income tax, the highest marginal rate would be 37%. So it was interesting to note here, I didn't realize this until a couple of years ago. I was living in Alberta thinking that Alberta was a best place to pay tax. That's not the case anymore. It's now going to be 50 basis point difference to live in Saskatchewan. I just found out my stepdaughter is moving from BC to Saskatchewan, so I'll make sure that she understands that she's going to be paying a little bit less tax in BC in Saskatchewan than BC. So on the income tax side, I'll go over in a few minutes just sort of what's been proposed by Trump and Harris, but I wanted to still focus on, again, the gift and estate issue. So on the gift side, so for those of you that are U.S. persons, U.S. citizens, green card holders, or defined as a U.S. tax resident, you have the ability to do some estate planning and some gift planning by reducing your estate through gifts. And the U.S. for forever that I've been practicing, and Apollo mentioned he's 55. I happen to be 62, so I've been doing this a lot longer than Apollo. But you look pretty good, Apollo. So in any event, the annual gift tax exclusion for 2024 is $18,000 for those of you who've been around for quite some time. And when I started my practice back in 1985, the gift tax limit at that time was $10,000. So it's been creeping up typically every 2 years on an inflation-adjusted basis. And so this year, $18,000. Next year, what's been proposed for 2025 is that the annual exclusion would be $19,500. So if you are a U.S. person and you want to give your new friend Terry some money and you happen to give me $20,000, well, $20,000 is greater than the annual exclusion that you're entitled to, which is $18,000. So therefore, under our gift tax rules, you would have a taxable gift of $2,000. So what would be your obligation? You would have an obligation to file a gift tax return. On the bottom there, we've indicated that's a 709 form, the IRS 709 form. You file at the same time you file your 1040, your tax return, and then you'd report that $2,000 taxable gift. Do you have to take any money out of your pocket and pay that tax now? The answer is no. And the reason why the answer is no is because under the Trump administration, he kind of aligned the lifetime lifetime gift tax exclusion to be the same as the estate tax exclusion to cover off any gift tax you have. So the lifetime gift tax exclusion right now is the same as the estate tax exemption, which is $13.61 million. So there would be no gift tax to pay, but that gift tax would sort of grind down over time is if you continue to make those taxable gifts. If you are a U.S. citizen, a U.S. taxpayer, married to a non-citizen spouse, and we have many clients that are in that situation. We have a U.S. citizen married to a client who is a green card holder, a non-citizen spouse. There's a different limitation on how much can be transferred from the U.S. citizen to the non-citizen, and that number is $185,000 for this tax year, and next year that's scheduled to go up to $190,000. And again, anything over and above that would be subject to the filing of a gift tax return and then the utilization of the gift tax, the lifetime gift tax exclusion. When Obama was president, that lifetime gift tax exclusion was capped at $1 million. So the significant increase that came out of the Trump administration has really impacted the amount of gifts that can be made and whether there's actually any tax to pay, any gift tax to pay on that. And again, this only applies to U.S. residents. So snowbirds wouldn't have this implication or these exclusions. And for 2025, that's supposed to go up to 13.99. I'm not sure why they didn't make it to $14 million, but it's $13.99 million. On the estate tax side, so the U.S. has a value tax, a death tax imposed when you become an angel, and it's based on the total value of your worldwide estate, and in some cases that would be inclusive of any insurance that you might own. There's some rules that relate to if insurance proceeds would be part of that. But if you have an estate that exists today and it's worth more than $13.61 million, then there would be an estate tax filing requirement. There's some planning that can be done between spouses to defer that. So effectively, if you're not worth more than, if you're a married couple not worth more than $27 million worldwide, then generally there's no U.S. estate tax that will be imposed. This top rate is 40%, and as I mentioned, just like the lifetime gift tax exclusion, it's supposed to be $13.99 million. We'll talk about what's going to happen in 2026 or the end of 2025 related to these numbers. And again, if you're a Canadian, there's some specific provisions under the treaty that can be utilized to allow many Canadians that own U.S. property that would be subject to U.S. estate tax, a non-resident estate tax, to take advantage of these exemptions so that they don't have any U.S. estate tax. That being said, even though a Canadian might own what we call U.S. situs property, they may own stock in Microsoft or Disney or other U.S. companies, but they've never been to the U.S. or spend time in the U.S. If they become an angel and the value of those shares are more than $60,000, there will be the requirement to file a U.S. estate tax return to prove to the custodians and prove to the IRS that there's no U.S. estate tax. It's a real pain in the butt to deal with. It generally takes at least 2 years to unwind that kind of stuff. So the assets are frozen. So you need to be aware of that if you're going to be owning some U.S. assets as a non-resident. And again, those are provisions under the treaty. If you're a non-resident, you file a 706 NA. And if you're a U.S. citizen resident, you file a 706 Form 4. And those forms are required to be filed 9 months after the date of death, and tax payments will be made at that time as well. Okay, so we've had pretty wonky estate tax environment, bit of a moving target for the last number of years, and this just is a graph that kind of indicates the level of exemptions that we've had over the last number of years. You can see here in 2010, when Biden was the president, there was a bit of a blip here where there was actually no estate tax was imposed in that year. So some of the wealthier people that died that year and didn't have to pay any estate tax, or at least their state didn't. George Steinbrenner, he died that year, no estate tax on his significant estate. I can't recall the name of the person that ran Carnival Cruise Lines, but no estate tax level there. And then the third person I know of, Enterprise Energy, the Duncan family, significant assets there, no estate tax. And the reason I know about that one, I had a client many years ago who was an executive with Enterprise Energy. So my joke back in those days when I would speak about this is that that lots of these wealthy families would hire food tasters so they can make sure that their kids weren't going to poison them, so that they would get a significant amount of estate tax, a significant amount of their wealth without any estate tax. So right now it's a bit of a moving target, and we'll see what happens after 2025, and I'll talk about that in just a few minutes. Okay, so this is actually a picture of Trump signing the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, a new acronym for you today, the TCJA. And so that was passed in 2017. And there's some significant developments that occurred there. Tax rates were lowered from what we'll talk about, what Harris is proposing here. There was the child tax credit was increased. He's proposing in the future to go ahead and reduce some level of capital gains exposure. These are all quite fluid, so I've updated these current as the information I have from both candidates. As you recall, when he was in Nevada a number of months ago campaigning, he came up with that no tax on tips, and now on overtime. So those are two things that he's thrown out there. And then he's also looking to exempt Social Security benefits from income tax, a significant benefit that certainly many of our clients would have the enjoyment of. And then this is brand spanking new here. Last week he was in Michigan, and he mentioned to the folks in Michigan that he would go ahead and allow for interest on auto loans to be deductible. He hasn't really gone into the details. If you're not able to itemize, do you still get that benefit? Those kinds of things. So I think he's kind of pandering to. They all are pandering to a certain base, and those are the three here that are new from previous. But this is a brand new one as well. Matt and I were sometimes we text at night new things that we hear about, and Matt happened to text me this, and I had already seen it. But Trump is proposing, I guess, to try to get the expat vote, the Americans that live and work abroad, to go ahead and reduce any tax exposure or reduce the appearance of double taxation related to expats who earn income abroad that might not be U.S. source. So there's not a lot of detail on this, but it's quite interesting. I was talking to our tax manager Karen here last week about this, and what's interesting here is that here's Trump who comes in and he creates the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, and then he creates all these tax burdens for Canadians, or I'm sorry, Americans Americans in Canada that have business enterprises and are subject to the GILTI tax and things like that. So it's quite interesting to see that him kind of about face here. But in any event, it's something that he's thrown out there, and we'll see where that goes. On the gift tax side, he's looking to reduce the gift tax, maybe even eliminate it, and then continuing, depending on what happens there, but continuing to align the gift tax lifetime exclusion towards the estate tax exclusion. And there's also some discussion related to just allowing for a greater level of tax-free gifts that can be transferred to heirs during one's lifetime. On the estate side, he's looking, and this is something that's been batted around for years that I've been practicing, is that the Republicans might just ultimately just get rid of the estate tax. And I have a slide in a few minutes that you'll see that relates to how many Americans, how many families actually do end up paying estate tax in the U.S., and it's a rather small number. So does it even make sense to do that? Should they change that to make it somewhat like what we have in Canada, where there's a disposition tax that would be imposed based on a level of wealth exceeding a certain level, and with an exemption. So we'll see what happens there. But he's also, again, looking into a full exemption. In the U.S., we have a really unique stepping up in basis regime. So if my dad owned XYZ stock that he bought for $1, and then he becomes an angel, and the value of those shares are much higher, and so much higher that they exceed the estate tax exemption, exceed the estate tax exemption of 13.61 this year. Let's say they're $14 million. When my dad becomes an angel, if my dad had that scenario and he had $14 million of shares that he bought for $1, when he dies, there'll be a estate tax that will be imposed on the amount beyond the 1361 and the $14 million. But Terry, his son, his beneficiary, I would receive those shares at $14 million. That stepping up of basis to the beneficiary is quite unique. And if I sold those shares the next day, all those unrealized capital gains that effectively would have been realized if he lived in Canada, for example, would not be subject to any income tax to me. So it's a significant benefit that can be available to beneficiaries in the U.S. side. Our friend Kamala Harris here has changes that she's proposing. They're very similar to the changes that Matt and I shared with you some 4 years ago, and they're very similar to what Biden has. One of the most significant ones here is that there's this NIT tax. The NIT tax, the net investment income tax, came out of the Obama administration as a means to somewhat cover off the cost of Obamacare. And it's a separate investment tax, a separate income tax, or surtax is what they call it, that will be imposed on investment income and certain other types of income. And right now it's 3.8% if your income's over a certain level, if you're married or if you file married separately. And right now she's thinking about increasing that to 5% from the 3.8% surtax. She wants to expand the child tax credit base. She wants to go ahead and provide new homeowners $25,000 to buy their first home. And then she's also looking to expand the earned income credit, which is effectively a credit that would be available to families that have a fair amount of children and don't make an awful lot of money. There's actually a refundable credit that they're going to get. My stepson, who's got 6 kids, he benefits every year from this credit. He makes about $30,000 and gets about $13,000 a year from the government because he's got 6 kids, and so it's a significant benefit that he derives every year through the earned income credit. And some other things that she's proposing is also, and you can see why Trump is a little mad here, is that she's also now, after he claimed that this was his idea, is that Kamala came back and said no, she's going to do the same thing again. So I thought I'd throw a picture of him getting a little teed off there. She's likely to reintroduce the SALT tax, the SALT deduction, the sales tax deduction, and sale and income tax deduction. Many of the blue states, New York and California, for example, don't have the ability in many cases to go ahead and deduct the higher level of state income taxes that are imposed in those specific states. And so because of that, those taxpayers are losing out on a significant tax benefit they previously would have received. So she's looking to bring that back in. I'll talk about that just a little bit when I talk about the sunsetting. And then there's a provision that we have available under the Internal Revenue Code allowing taxpayers the ability to buy real estate. And if they go ahead and sell that and buy something of greater or equal value, they can defer that. It's a provision called the 1031 exchange. They can go ahead and defer that gain. There's some specific guidelines and rules that have to be fulfilled by the taxpayer in order to get this benefit. But she's now looking to limit that benefit up to $500,000. So we'll see what happens there. She's looking to raise the corporate tax rate from 21 to 28%. And then there's some not very clear changes that she's proposing related to key employees, and then some complex domestic and international changes. One of the biggest changes that she's looking to impose that we have to be cognizant of, and Biden had proposed this as well, and somewhat similar. The significant difference here is this NIT tax that Kamala is suggesting that she would throw in there as well. So the current long-term capital gain rate is 20%. When you throw in the 2.8%, 3.8% surtax on top of that, so it maxes out at 23.8% is what we have now. But she's looking to increase the long-term capital gain rates to 28%. Plus the 5% NIT tax, so 34%. So a much higher level of capital gains taxes that would be imposed under her regime. And I'll show you a slide on that in just a second. She's looking to eliminate the stepping up of basis at death. My father's example that I was sharing with you would not apply if Kamala and her administration got her way. There are some significant benefits for those of our clients that are investing in what we call qualified dividends. And those qualified dividends, even though if you're at the 37% rate, you'd only have to pay 15% on those dividends. She's now looking to go ahead and eliminate that if your tax income was over $1 million. And so there wouldn't be any as significant a benefit in investing in qualified dividends because that rate would be at 28%. And then again, she's looking at different types of wealth tax that would be imposed. There's lots of very wealthy individuals that are quite concerned about this. I'm not sure how they're going to track and follow and administer all this stuff, but she's looking to have a different form of a wealth tax that would be imposed. You can see from this graph, this is from the Tax Foundation, that this would be some of the highest capital gain rates that we've seen in a long time in this country, in the U.S. right now. So that's shared with that. And then if we go ahead and throw in the states in there as well, and the capital gain rates that she's proposing, again, it could be quite significant for taxpayers that live in California and in New York, and some of the other higher tax states. This was an interesting slide. It just sort of shares with us that no matter what source of income we're looking at, corporate, or personal, or capital gains, we are not as competitive as the OECD averages, and they're certainly not as good as what we're enjoying under the current administration and based on the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act that was passed by Trump. So what she's looking to do on the estate and gift tax side is to reduce the estate and gift tax exemption down to $3.5 million. Many people believe that would be a little bit higher than that, but she's suggested down to $3.5 million. She'll bring back the annual gift tax exclusion per person to $10,000. And then there's a different level of estate tax that would be imposed, 55, 60, and 65%. As I mentioned earlier, the current max rate for estate tax purposes is 40%. Another surtax that would be imposed on really, really super wealthy clients, $1 billion, 10% surtax. And this is what I was going to share with you. According to the most recent IRS data that I found, only 0.2% of U.S. adults are subject to the federal estate tax. So we spend an awful lot of time on the estate planning side, worrying about estate tax exposure. But in most cases, very few people in the U.S. pay estate tax. And I think that would be the case for Bill Gates and for Warren Buffett. I was going to say Jimmy Buffett, but for Warren Buffett, Jimmy Buffett had a really large estate. So I'm sure he had estate tax exposure. But for Warren Buffett and for Bill Gates, these are families that have created foundations, private foundations, and have plenty of insurance in place. And so there's estate tax exposure, but they're actually not having to sell assets to pay that tax, and because of the kind of planning that they've done over time. So that if we were to compare both of our candidates here, Trump versus Harris under the income, gift, and estate tax side of things, as I've indicated here, Trump's focusing on continuing the lower marginal tax, and maybe even future lower marginal tax rates. And then Harris is going to go after the wealthy, the higher income taxpayers, and those kinds of things at both the estate and gift level. Trump is looking to, again, eliminate gift tax and maybe estate tax as well. So very different ways to achieve their respective objectives. Time will tell. As I mentioned again, we had some of these concerns when Biden became president, and even the Congress was controlled by the Democrats. Nothing happened. So we'll have to wait and see what happens after the 5th of November. One thing we have to be cognizant of, though, is that because of the way that the Tax Cuts and Job Act was passed by Trump, is that they're basically what we call sunset. They expire at the end of 2025. So in 2026, unless the next Congress, the next administration is able to finalize things, we're going to see things sort of going back to what they were prior to the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act being passed. So that means that we're going to go ahead and see, because this would be all the stuff under the Obama administration. So the top federal tax rate would go back to 39.6% as opposed to 37%. Most U.S. taxpayers have the ability to take the higher standard deduction as opposed to itemize. So because the standard deductions become much higher in the U.S., there hasn't been the incentive to go ahead and deduct mortgage interest, charitable donations, property taxes, state income taxes, those kinds of things. If the sunset does take place, and then most people will likely be able to itemize. And so what we'll see there is that self-deduction will come back for those higher income taxpayers in New York State and in California. Mortgage interest would then be deductible. There's not that incentive any longer to get the deduction. You can still deduct it, but the standard deduction typically exceeds most of our taxpayers' itemized deduction thresholds under current law. And then miscellaneous deductions, our fees for managing client accounts, things like that, are deductible for Canadian clients because Canadian tax law allows for that. That's not the case under U.S. laws because of the higher standard deductions. If the sunset did take place, then we'd have the ability to deduct those kinds of fees, and for professional athletes, agent fees as well. But in order to do that, one, you have to be able to itemize, and secondly, your income has to exceed, or the deductions have to exceed 2% of your adjusted gross income. Total tax credits will go down a bit, and then we'll come back to having the personal exemptions for ourselves and for our family members as well, to be $2,000. So from a planning perspective, what should we do? So if we believe that higher tax rates are going to kick in 2026, then it might make sense to defer. If you're a sole practitioner, you have a business or something like that, it might make sense to defer those purchases or defer expenses that you want to take until 2026, when tax rates could potentially be higher because of the retroactive treatment here. Obviously, we're always encouraging clients to max out their 401k plans or 403b plans, IRAs in the U.S. to reduce tax. Roth conversions can make sense, particularly if you're moving back to Canada and you have a bit of a window where your tax rates are lower on the U.S. side. Roth conversions can make sense. And if we expect that tax rates in the U.S. are going to be higher in the future than they are now, then it could make sense to do some Roth conversions this year or even next year before the sunsetting takes place. So those are things that we as advisors for you can speak with you about. And then again, if capital gains are going to go up, again, a much higher rate plus the NIT of 5%, it may make sense to realize capital gains before the sunsetting takes place at the end of 2025. Charitable donations, you might want to defer those to the future because you'll have the ability to have higher tax rates, higher benefits, and be able to itemize. And then from a business perspective, it may make sense to restructure your business and to use C Corps because of the increase from the corporate rate from 21 to 28%. On the estate tax side, unless the administration and the Congress change some of the things that Kamala was sharing, if she becomes president, what's supposed to happen is that we'd have the estate tax exemption go from the $14 million number for each person, just cut that in half. So it'd be $7 million for each client, for each taxpayer. So what most people believe is that the estate tax exemption that was in place in 2017 on an inflation-adjusted basis would come in at the $7 million range for each client, and that the estate tax rate would still come back in at 40%, which is what it is right now. So other planning things to think about, and I've had a few clients who have substantial levels of wealth that will exceed the combined addition of each of the exemption amounts. And so what some of those clients have done, and some of you might consider doing, is to go ahead and make substantial gifts. If you don't need the wealth right now, make substantial gifts before the lifetime gift tax exclusion might go from $14 million down to 3.5 or $1 million or whatever it ultimately ends up becoming. And so some of the ways to do that is the establishment of what's called a Spousal Lifetime Access Trust, another new acronym for you today. So that's a SLAT, and this gives you the ability to basically take wealth out of your state. You'll have to file a gift tax return. And again, if it's underneath the lifetime gift tax exclusion limit, you've got some room, there'll be no gift tax or income tax to pay. And what happens is this is an irrevocable trust that will continue to grow over time on a taxable basis, but it's taxable to you, gives you some level of control to utilize those dollars over time. And then upon your passing, it'll be whatever it's worth, and it'll go to your beneficiaries free of estate tax. And there's also benefits that we can utilize through a structure. Another new acronym for you today called a GRAT, a Grantor Retained Annuity Trust. So those are all the things I wanted to share with you today. I think we can take a few questions if there are any. I got two here. Can you see those, Matt?
Yeah. So thank you very much for that, Terry. I think it's great to just kind of have the context of, here's some things that may happen. Again, you just don't know what the makeup of, the political system in DC will look like come a couple months from now. And then, even if we were to know that in advance, I think we don't know exactly how they would address some of those elements that are sunsetting, which ones may be, able to be continued on, which ones might revert back to some of those previous levels. I believe Apollo is just having to leave here, but I definitely appreciate his time on the call with us today.
Same. Thank you, Matt. It was great fun talking to you.
Thanks, Apollo.
Yeah.
Thanks, Terry. Great seeing you. Bye-bye.
But maybe just we do have a few of the questions we can.
There's more comments than there are questions. One of the questions related to there seems to be a fairly long time lag between policy changes and results, and that's true. As I mentioned, the Biden administration had the opportunity to do lots of different things on the tax policy side. That didn't happen. And then, of course, we had 2 years later, Congress changing, the House was then becoming controlled by the Republicans, and so the tax policies just didn't get through. They did other things, and so it's possible that it's going to happen again. And so all the things I've just shared with you may never come to fruition, because we may have what Biden's had, which is a divided, I think the term is a lame duck president. So it's still something that we have to obviously monitor. And be aware of. And I think after the 5th of November, we will reach out to our clients that we think we need to around some of these changes. But it's very fluid, and some of the stuff may never come to fruition at all. And then, of course, for our clients in Canada, in October, we have an election that, based on current results, our current polling would suggest that Trudeau's time in office is going to change, or the Liberals might change. And so Pierre, if he's the candidate right now that's leading in the polls, and he's suggesting that tax policies will be looked at significantly, and there may be a different environment in Canada. As many of you know, there are significant capital gain changes that occurred in Canada in June, after June 25th of this year. And so we'll have, again, as I showed you with the estate tax graph, we have a bit of a moving target here in both countries, and our job is to try to, as I tell most prospective clients, to make you aware of the good and the bad and the ugly of the things that are being thrown our way.
Yeah, well, and maybe I'll take one of the investment ones, and then there's a few other tax ones we might be able to touch on briefly right after. But just in regards to most of the data that Apollo went through and that we've discussed, in some of the blogs or other pieces are, basically just for the U.S. markets, and trying to get a sense of, okay, is the a environment where one party or another has better outcomes, and really the data will just show you that it's better off to be a long-term investor and stay invested through the ups and the downs, or the different parties over time. The one thing that we do also look to do oftentimes is bring in some of the international stocks, bond positions, some of the other alternatives or different pieces there that we can add into a portfolio that can kind of buffer some of the ups and downs that we will see, regardless of who wins in November. The one thing I can guarantee is we'll have a downturn at some point, whether that's, in 2025 or the year or two after. Every president term is going to have some meaningful drawdowns, and we're going to expect that to happen over time. And we want to have that baked into the original financial plan that we're working on with you. And so that's where, when we have some of those relatively lower growth rate assumptions in there, that's kind of the idea that we're going to have, years like the last 12 months where we can have a, plus 20, 25% types of returns for, more balanced portfolios. We also know there's going to be some other years like a 2022 when, an overall diversified portfolio might be down 5 or 10% or so. We want to look at different elements like that. We've really expanded, I think, some of the offerings that we've had in some of those areas the last few years that we hope can help balance out those portfolios a little bit more for, whenever those downturns occur, whether those are brought on from, any, actions in DC or just, actions, from other countries or other elements of the economy, COVID-19 types of scenarios that you just really wouldn't have planned for, are all ways that we want to try to make the portfolios as robust as possible, but still not give up, all of the upside that we could see in these markets here.
Hey, Matt, just to let you know, I had that wrong because my meeting wasn't till later. So sorry about that.
Okay.
If there are any questions, anything I can contribute, I still have time. I don't know why I thought that.
Maybe, interestingly enough, the question related to Warren Buffett. Do you want to read that one to him, Matt, to see what Apollo's answer might be?
Sure. I think just kind of the idea of, if we see, headlines or things about, Warren Buffett getting out of the market, or, I think that could apply to a lot of people too. You'll see a hedge fund manager or somebody say, oh, or short the market, or, we're worried about this or that happening. I mean, how should we as investors kind of think through that, or say, well, okay, this person is obviously a very good investor. They have a great long-term track record. Should I be doing something because of this headline?
Yeah, and I think that you're right. You want to see what investors are doing, and what's interesting about investing is that when you decide to buy and sell these shares, you're not really trading with the company itself. You're trading with some other investor who has a different belief. And what we've seen over and over the years is that for every pessimist in the market, there has to be an optimist, because for every seller, there has to be a buyer. And quite often you would have a spectrum of opinions about where the markets might go next. So I absolutely believe that when you look at the markets, you're going to see people with different opinions. And what I think it's interesting about the stock market as a whole, in the valuation of different companies, it's incorporating both the optimist and the pessimist in the current valuation. Because obviously things are obviously going to go down. Who's the guy or the gal who's going to buy? I mean, you can't be that foolish. So somebody has to have a different opinion. And if you talk about Warren Buffett, there are two things about Warren Buffett that I think it's interesting. In his personal money, and he's made this clear over and over and over again, that I'm invested in a broadly diversified market portfolio. And for his own family money, he is not in the business of picking stocks. He wants to get the S&P. He wants a broadly diversified, low-cost approach to investing rather than this idea of stock picking. In the companies that he owns, the reality is that he's not just a passive investor. He buys enough chunks where he can actually get involved in the operation of that company. And that's very different than what you and I can do. So that's the first thing to note, is that he is, for his own money, he's not engaged in this. He's like, for my family, it's all in the S&P. And in fact, if you remember Warren Buffett, he placed $1 million bet with a hedge fund manager saying that over the course of a number of years, the S&P will outperform your brilliant ideas. And that's exactly what happened. And he actually won the $1 million. Secondly, he's also looking abroad. He's not limiting himself to opportunities in the U.S. And one of the big investments that I remember reading about years ago was this company called Build Your Dreams, or the initials known as BYD. Well, it turns out that that company eventually became the largest, today is the largest manufacturer of electric cars, selling more cars than Tesla. And it's certainly like this idea of not necessarily limiting yourself to the US. But the last thing I'll tell you folks about this idea is this the right time to be invested in the market? I've had this conversation recently at a retirement community where an advisor asked me to talk to the investment club and ask, what does the investment club do? Well, they watch the market every day and they go play tennis. But it's interesting because as I was talking to them, they wanted to kind of get the idea. I'm nervous about the market. Should I get out? And the first thing is to know that you have a plan, and the advisor created a plan the same way that Matt was talking about. But the second thing that I told them, they're like two other important considerations if you're thinking about this idea about getting in and out of the market. Number one, when you get out of the market, there's an equally important decision that you ought to make at exactly the same time. When do you get back in? And over, what I see people is like, I don't think it's looking good. I'm going to get out. And as they see the market rallying, their stress of being in the market was quickly replaced by the stress of being out of the market. But the second thing, which I think is fundamental, investing and life in general is not about certainty or guarantees. That's not it, folks. Nobody can guarantee anything. In fact, even if I've been eating healthy and working out a little more. I'm not guaranteed a longer lasting, healthier life. No way. I mean, plenty of buses around. But you want to put the odds in your favor. Everything in life, business decision, life decision, everything is about making sure that you get a bit of an edge in life. So when it comes to investing, there's some really important statistics that all of you should know. And the first one is that if you watch the market daily, like those retirees, what's so fascinating is that in 2024, as well as the past 50 years, incredibly consistent on a daily basis, if you watch the market, the split between positive and negative days is roughly even. 53% of all trading days in the market this year and the past 50 years on average have been positive. You made money. 47% you lost money. So if you watch the market daily, you're going to drive yourself nuts. Those people had a spring in their step, half to dime, and the other half they're depressed because that's what the market does. Incredibly choppy. Be ready for that ride. It's just a par for the course. Don't get surprised by that. Now, if you are willing to give markets some time to work for you, and this is the S&P 500, what you see is on a quarterly basis over the past 50 years, the stock market, the S&P 500, was up 71% of the time and only down 29% of the time. So if you get out of the market, you miss a bad quarter, you pat yourself on the back and say, great, I saved money. In reality, your odds are totally against you. It's as if you play at a table where you stand to lose 71% of the time. That's exactly what happens when you get out of the market. What are you more likely to miss statistically, a good quarter or a bad quarter? And we're not talking about years, a good quarter, bad quarter. You're much more likely to miss a good quarter. And what happens from one quarter to another, as we all know, it's quite random. And if you are actually patient enough for the whole year, what's fascinating is that on a yearly basis, 78% of the years over the past 50 years have been positive. You made money in the S&P and you lost in 22%. So, you give it a year, not a guarantee you're going to make money, but much more often than not, you are going to have a positive outcome. So this idea now is that if you decide to get out of the market because something doesn't look good, again, the odds are against you. On a daily basis, I would say it's probably a flip of a coin, but the more time you stay out of the market, the worse your odds become. And then I wanted to that community, I wanted to relate to the other hobby they had, tennis. And I'm not a big tennis player. But I watch tennis as much as the guy next door. But I do know this one gentleman, Matt. I don't know if you recognize him.
Yeah.
Roger Federer.
Yeah.
He's arguably the all-time best male player. He retired a couple of years ago, and an amazing career. So he's not an average player. He's the all-time best. And I was curious to know, how do you become a champion? Again, look at the statistics. And if you look at Roger Federer, the all-time best, not an average player, and you ask what percentage of the points did he win in his career, well, it turns out that Roger Federer, the all-time best, won 54% of the points that he played, meaning that he lost roughly half the points that he played. If you watch him play any one point, it wasn't obvious he was going to win it. But Roger stuck in there. He played all the points. He won the big ones. And if you give him some time and he asked the question, what percentage of the sets did he win? Well, he won about 75% of the sets that he played. And if you're really patient enough to wait for the whole game, he won about 81% of the matches that he played. And I think it's an incredibly powerful story to relate to the market, that you don't need to win every point to be the world's best. You don't need to make money in the market to have a successful investment experience. You just have to be in there. And the more you give time to Roger Federer or the stock market, the more likely it is that you'll see a positive outcome. So I think that in that respect, if you're nervous about the market, well, know that on a daily basis, roughly half the days you're going to lose money. But the more you give market time to work for you, the more likely it is that you see a positive outcome. And I think Warren Buffett, by and large, that's kind of the mentality, in my opinion, that he has, rather than trying to get nervous and get out of the market. And if you hear people with that opinion, great, that's their opinion. For every buyer, there's a seller. For every optimist, there's a pessimist.
Yeah. Well, no, thank you very much. Maybe to stick on that tennis theme for just one last second, they actually had Serena Williams at a conference I was at just earlier this week in the LA area, and kind of talking about some new venture funds that she started and kind of a second career that she's launching. But she was talking about her tennis career and thinking through the idea of, she would just win, Wimbledon one year, but she's like, okay, I didn't even think about that. The next day I was working with my dad again, saying I need to improve my serve. I need to do this and that. And I know I can win, the US Open that's coming up. But it was really just amazing to kind of hear that, she was saying I wasn't looking in the rearview mirror at all. I was always looking at what was in front of me and how I could improve. And, I think we try to do that with portfolios a lot of times, to say, whether it's been a good year or a bad year, what can we do going forward? How can we help, make things, best suited for a variety of events that we aren't going to know, exactly how things are going to play out over the, coming quarters or years. But the great stats there about Federer. With that, I think we better, wrap it up. We had a couple other, some more other tax specific questions, but I'd encourage anyone to send those on to your advisor that you work with, or info@cardinalpointwealth.com. We'll look to get a posting of this up in the near future and get that out to everybody. But definitely appreciate everyone's time, and thank you, Apollo. Thank you, Terry. Have a good afternoon here.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.